All right, I want to spend some time talking about the governing of this new empire that America built in the 1890s. Three of America's new dependencies, Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico, presented relatively few problems. They received territorial status, and by becoming a territory, therefore, the people there became citizens rather quickly. 1900, 1912, and 1917, respectively, for the three dependencies. The Navy took control of Guam and Samoa, and some very small islands were simply left alone. Now, Cuba was a thornier problem. U.S. forces under General Leonard Wood remained there until 1902 to prepare the island for independence. They built roads, schools, hospitals, reorganized the legal, financial, and administrative systems of the island, introduced medical and sanitation reforms. But that was all good, but the U.S. also laid the groundwork for years of U.S. economic domination of the island. When Cuba drew up a constitution that made no mention of the United States, Congress responded by passing something called the Platt Amendment, named after Senator Orville Platt. I left the L out there, but it's P-L-A-T-T. In 1901, and this was an amendment to an earlier joint resolution passed by Congress dealing with Cuba, and they pressured Cuba into incorporating the Platt Amendment's terms into their constitution, basically saying Cuba really couldn't run its own foreign affairs. Now, American capital quickly took over the island's economy. U.S. investors bought up plantations, factories, railroads, and refineries. U.S. absentee ownership was an important source of agitation and resentment for decades. Resistance to Yankee imperialism, as it was called, produced intermittent revolts against the Cuban government, in which reality were puppet governments of the U.S. This often resulted in U.S. military intervention. U.S. troops occupied the island again from 1906 to 1909 and returned again in 1912 to suppress a revolt by black plantation workers. As with Puerto Rico and Hawaii, access to the U.S. economy spurred sugar production and created a dependence on the crop, which resulted in the same boom and bust cycles that plagued other sugar-producing appendages of the U.S. Now, Americans don't like to think of themselves as imperial rulers in the European mold, but they quickly discovered as they discovered dealing with American Indians, that the subjugation of another people requires more than ideals. It requires strength and brutality. The U.S. soon became engaged in a long and bloody war with insurgent forces in the Philippines fighting for independence. This is the least remembered of all American wars. It lasted from 1898 to 1902, and it was one of the most vicious wars in U.S. history. It involved 200,000 American troops and resulted in 4,300 American deaths, nearly 10 times the number who died in the Spanish-American War. The number of Filipinos killed is unknown and controversial, but it seems likely that at least 50,000 Filipinos, and perhaps many more, died. The U.S. faced guerrilla tactics very similar to those faced by the Spanish in Cuba, and they soon found themselves drawn into the same pattern of brutality that had outraged so many Americans when General Weyler had used them in Cuba. Now, the Filipinos had been rebelling against the Spanish well before 1898. When they realized the Americans had come to stay, they rebelled against them as well. The rebels were very capably led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who claimed to head the legitimate government of the nation. They harassed the U.S. Army of Occupation for more than 3 years. At first, U.S. commanders believed the rebels had only a small popular following, but in 1900, General Arthur MacArthur, an unfortunate name, and he is the father, by the way, of Douglas MacArthur, who will be a general very intimately linked with the Philippines in World War II. But General MacArthur wrote in 1900, quote, "I have been reluctantly compelled to believe that the Filipino masses are loyal to Aguinaldo and the government which he heads," unquote. This realization was not a reason to moderate U.S. tactics. Rather, it was seen as a reason to adopt much more severe measures. Gradually, the U.S. military became more systematically vicious and brutal. Captured Filipino guerrillas were treated not as POWs but as murderers. Most were summarily executed. On some islands, entire communities were evacuated, the residents forced into concentration camps, while American troops destroyed their villages, farms, crops, livestock. A spirit of savagery grew among some American soldiers who came to view Filipinos as almost subhuman, that sort of naturalistic racism we talked about, and at times almost seemed to take pleasure in killing arbitrarily. One commander ordered his troops to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me. When asked to specify an age limit, he said, "Shoot everyone over the age of 10." By 1902, reports of the brutality of the American casualties had soured the American public on the war, but by then the rebellion had largely exhausted itself and the U.S. had established control over most of the islands. The key to victory was the March 1901 capture of Aguinaldo, who later signed a document urging his followers to stop fighting and declaring his allegiance to the U.S. He retired from public life and lived quietly until 1964. Fighting continued in some places for another year, and war revived intermittently until as late as 1906, but American possession of the Philippines was now largely secure. In the summer of 1901, the military transferred authority over the islands to the first civilian governor, who was William Howard Taft. Taft announced that the U.S. mission in the Philippines was to prepare the islands for independence, and he gave the Filipinos broad local autonomy. They did a lot of good work. The U.S. built roads, schools, bridges, and sewers, instituted major administrative and financial reforms, established a public health system. The Philippine economy, which was largely fishing, agriculture, mining, and timber, became increasingly linked to the economy of the U.S. Americans did not make many investments in the Philippines, and few Americans moved there, but trade with the U.S. grew to the point that the islands were almost completely dependent on U.S. markets. Meanwhile, American governors gave Filipinos political autonomy. Not until July 4th, 1946, however, did the islands gain their independence.